So we know that the image of light is important in our world and in our own hearts and lives, that Jesus comes to enlighten us, illumine us, to give us vision, to allow us to see both sometimes the darkness within our own hearts, to illuminate the little crevices and corners of our hearts, but also to shine forth the beauty that's within us, that God has made us in His own image, and that the light brings out that beauty and that image of who we were made to be, right? That's part of who we are. And as we look at today's gospel reading, what I'd like to do is take a look a little bit at that call of the disciples, of the light that has now entered into the darkness and now is drawing others to Himself, right? So we have this image of those fishermen that were called, Peter and Andrew, James and John, that were by the Sea of Galilee as Jesus went there. And like last week, I want to go a little bit into the context. So we have the text that's before us, and we want to frame that in some of the context. And so I think it's important to be able to do that, to understand a little bit about fishermen around the Sea of Galilee. So the Sea of Galilee is about 13 miles long, 7.5 miles wide. It is about 150 feet deep at the deepest part. There's a shore sort of all the way around it, but it's surrounded by mountains. It is, in fact, the lowest freshwater sea that's in the world. It's about 680 to 690 feet below sea level. Everybody say that's low. So freshwater, it's got a number of different kinds of fish, somewhere between 18 and 24 indigenous varieties of fish that are part of the Sea of Galilee, from small fish like sardines to big fish like an African catfish. The most common fish was tilapia that they fished. That was mostly eaten by the people surrounding the Sea of Galilee, but they would sell the catfish to the Gentiles because the Jewish people, because it didn't have scales, it was an unclean fish, so they couldn't eat the catfish. And the sardines were helpful or popular because they would take those and put them in brine and preserve them, pickle them, and those would be sold on the international market. In the international market, Galilee was where Jesus starts His ministry. Today we hear Him going about preaching about the kingdom of God. Galilee was known, as you heard, even in the Old Testament times, as Galilee of the Gentiles. It was a crossroads, a trade route. Unlike Judah, the hill country of Judah where John the Baptist started his ministry, that was almost exclusively from Israel, from the Jewish people, right? So Jesus is starting in an area where there's a lot of interaction with various cultures, but that's where you could sell catfish, and that's where you could sell the sardines to be able to go and make some money on that. Everything else that wasn't suitable to sell, they kind of put in these big vats, and they would add salt, and they would let that ferment in the sun. Sounds delicious. And they would make a fish sauce out of that. And that went out throughout the whole Roman Empire. So there were a lot of sources of income from fishing in that area that was part of that local economy. Now, fishermen in that day and age would have fished all those things, possibly. When I was a little boy, my grandmother was an angler, right? She was a fisher person, I guess. We would mostly do bluegill. Right? We'd go out and cast the line on the dock behind her house in Carrollton, and we would reel in bluegill, and then Grandma would try to get me to clean the fish, and I didn't like that at all. She was very good at it. You know, why infringe upon somebody else's skill? And so we'd fry up bluegill. Sometimes we'd get some bass or something, but mostly it was a small little lake. So we were there. The most popular, not most popular, most printed book in the English language is the Bible. You know the second most printed book in the English language? The complete works of Shakespeare, right? So you have Shakespeare. You know the third most printed book in the English language? It's from the 1600s. The Complete Angler. A book about fishing. Is the third most printed book in the English language. That kind of shows that it has a lot to do with our imagination, right? People engage in fishing. Some do it meditatively. Some do it out of frustration. Some do it for their own food, right? So we have that kind of thing. Fishing in Jesus' day included pretty much all that we would expect. So they have excavated hooks, fish hooks. There's a place where Jesus tells Peter to go and throw your hook into the sea, your line into the sea, and you pull out this fish that has 2 coins in it to be able to pay the temple tax. So there is a sense of you could have fished with a line and a hook with bait on it. That's probably catching some of the bigger fish, the ones that are predatory, not the plankton eaters and things like that. And then you could also stand on the shore. There's a couple ways to fish from there. They have excavated sort of like pitchforks where people would kind of spear fish, right? And then they also have nets that they've not excavated, but that we know that were there. Sort of the nets that you throw out from the shore. You wade out into the water and you throw those. There are bigger nets that are done through boats. That's done in primarily 2 ways. One is that you kind of form this net to drag the fish into the shore, and so you can bring the fish into the net and get them out of the shallow water. Or you've got fishing boats that you go out and you lower your nets, and usually 2 or 3 fishing boats would work together. They would spread the net. They might do it into a big circle and then draw the net in to close in the fish. That's probably how when Peter told Jesus, "We've been fishing all night and haven't caught anything," that's probably what they did. They were fishing with the boats and trying to draw in the nets, and then Jesus said, "Well, throw your nets over the other side of the boat," and they drew in more than they could possibly hold, or just about sinking the ships, right? There was this big catch. So in that kind of sense of fishing, when we've got the nets and working through all that, that might be what Jesus is talking about in that sense of gathering, going out and becoming fishers of men. Now, when we talk about fishers of men, that doesn't usually seem good for the fish, right? So it's not a perfect analogy. But for us, it is kind of a drawing forth from that which keeps us bound into freedom. Right? That's more of the image. There were some writings in Jesus' day that tied humans into being underwater and not being able to breathe, and then being brought out of the water through fishing so that you then were able to breathe and able to live. It was a sign of enlightenment, of kind of coming into this idea. Now, the fishermen would have been all different areas of sort of socioeconomic levels, right? We generally think of the fishermen when we hear the story as kind of being poor or subsistence or peasant fishermen. That could have been the case. There were people, of course, fishing along the sea, but to own a boat, which we hear about today, would have been a significant accomplishment. The boat recently excavated within the last decade or so was about 27 feet long, about 7 feet wide, 3 feet deep, could hold up to 12 people, 13 people. So Jesus, when his disciples went out on the sea and there was the storm, that was about the size of the boat that they were on. That you would have had to know, because it was a crossroads and you were selling your goods, multiple languages probably, Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic. It would have been common for fishermen, some fishermen, to know that. They would have had to be able to manage their books, pay the taxes, be able to organize labor. All those things would have been skills that they would have had if they had their own boat and their own fishing, like Zebedee, the father of James and John. So they would have had something of a business, even though it would have been subject to the rulers and the elite. So they would not have made a whole lot of money on it, although Zebedee's house in Capernaum is one of the larger houses. When they kind of excavated that and identified that, it's bigger than average size. So it meant that he was probably somewhat successful. However, it was difficult work, right? So you spent sometimes long days in the sun or at night, up all night, and then having to mend the nets in the morning after you're fishing all night. You could go long times without catching fish, right? So you needed some resilience. It was hard work, a little bit salty personalities generally, as we think of sailors today. The disciples might have spoken like a sailor before Jesus called them, right? That was part of that. So they're a little rough around the edges, even if they have all of these skills, but they have real resilience. All right. So what? Right? So what? Jesus calls real complex people. Each of us walk through life with sort of a surface image, right? We all walk through this life and people see certain things about us. They understand certain things about us. They perceive like who we are, where we live, what we've done, these kind of external things, but that doesn't encapsulate the fullness of who we are, and it doesn't encapsulate the fullness of who the first disciples of Jesus were. They were complex, interesting, skilled individuals. They had a variety of talents and abilities, of gifts and weaknesses. They were real people. Jesus doesn't call caricatures, right? He doesn't call external images or flat personalities. Jesus calls to real people, calls them by name, calls them in the complexity of their life, calls to them in the vast differences and variety of each person, right? Of each unique individual and their personality. Jesus doesn't kind of call out there in an abstract way. Jesus calls specifically to individuals who hear his voice and follow him. Jesus doesn't call the abstract. Jesus calls you.